Okay, good evening, everybody. It's Mike Buckham here, and I'm joined this evening with Dave Winter, my partner in crime, and our special guest, Mike Mason. Good evening, guys. Dave, you go first.
Hi, Mike. How's it going? Thanks for putting this all together tonight. I'm really looking forward to part 2 of tips and tricks for bird photographers.
Excellent, and welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Mike. It's nice to be here. Hello to everybody listening.
Awesome. So let's get started. We did a Zoom 101 last week, but I think we don't need to do that again. We'll spend some more time on bird photography. So let's just remind everybody who our special guest is. I managed to dig into the archives and find another photograph of Michael in his dressing gown. And then there's this great pic. Dana Goldberg gave us, we didn't even ask her permission, but it's a great photo, and Mike said we should just give her credit for it. Here's Mike at, I think, the white wagtail twitch, Mike.
Yes, that's the white wagtail spot.
And those are the wild horses of Kleinmond, as far as I'm aware. Not that wild.
Well, that one was very friendly.
And tell us, the dressing gown, was that the Upchurch warbler as well?
I'm not entirely sure where that one was taken, Mike. That might actually be the lesser noddy.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's get started. Those of you who were with us last week will remember that we dealt mostly with cameras and camera settings, and then a couple of tricks of the things that we do in the field. So we talked about where to approach birds and how to approach birds, and light and wind and side lighting and backlighting. This evening we're moving a little bit into the lab, and we'll talk about processing. We'll talk a bit about storage, which I think is critical if you don't want to lose your pics. Mark's a far better creative photographer than mine, so we'll share some of his pics there. And then what do you do when you've taken great photographs? How do you share those with your mates on Facebook, on Instagram, and potentially publish? And then we'll finish off with, I think what's quite important is how to go about ethical photography. So a couple of guidelines there, and we need to make sure that we don't disturb the birds that we're photographing. And then Mike's going to just tell us a story right at the end. So I think processing software, it's an absolute minefield. It's almost the same as buying a camera. What processing software does one use? And what I've done there is I've just listed just a brief snapshot of what is available out there, probably the better known ones. So everyone's heard of Photoshop. Most people have heard of Lightroom. iPhoto is the Apple photographic processing tool. And then I listed the Canon off the shelf, which is Digital Photo Professional, which I used for many years. And then I don't know much about the Nikon software, but Capture NXD is the Nikon software. So I've highlighted in yellow the different packages that I've actually used over the last 20 years that I've been taking digital photographs. So I've tried quite a few. Yeah, I think it's a matter of preference, affordability, and time, and what your ultimate objective is. I used iPhoto for many years because it was very quick and easy, but it definitely has limitations. I used DPP, the Canon software, also very good, but I didn't find it as easy as what I use now, which is Lightroom. So Mike, you and I both use Lightroom. I don't know, have you used other software as you've gone along, or has it mostly been in Lightroom?
No, I've definitely used some of those others there as well, Mike, but Lightroom is by far the one that I enjoy the most. It's quick, it's easy, and it also doubles as a way to access and find files quickly.
Yeah, I think it's changed quite a lot. I think there's, I mean, I've just thrown out those package selections at the bottom there, and it's no longer just a system that sits, or an executable that sits on your PC. It's also become a lot more integrated with access to the cloud, some storage mechanisms, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But certainly a lot more flexible, a lot easier to use. I find it quite quick as well. You don't get a lot of delays while using it. It's got quite a strong capacity, obviously dependent on your machine as well.
Yeah.
Dave, just a reminder to our listeners that they're welcome to throw in questions as and when. You're going to be curating those and just sending them through, so feel free to interrupt. Have we had any questions so far, Dave?
We haven't, but I've actually got a question. These Lightroom versions that you've listed here, are these cloud software? So you use them in a browser, or so it doesn't actually sit on your machine, right?
It does sit on your machine, so you get the actual sort of app that sits on your machine. But
Okay.
I find the biggest advantage, and what I'm using is the one on the right-hand side there, the 1 terabyte, $239 per annum software, and it gives you the whole suite of a whole bunch of Adobe products. But the benefit for me is the fact that it's got a cloud backup. So essentially, when I open the app on my machine and I upload my photos, it syncs to the cloud and it uploads all my photos to the cloud immediately. And the great thing about that as well is that if you download the app on your phone, you can access those photographs on your phone as well, and you can even process on the run with your phone. But I think we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. But essentially, it is an app on your machine, but it is linked to the cloud at all times when you're actually processing.
Just
Okay.
answering
There's actually
the
a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, Michael, go for it.
No, I was just noticed the question there in the chat room as well. You definitely do get with the program, you get an app which you can download to your phone, and you can have it on 2 machines as far as I remember. I've got it on my laptop and my desktop with a single purchase.
Yeah, I think that's an advantage as well. And I think, Dave, if I'm not mistaken, I think you can probably log in on a remote machine as long as you've got access to the internet and probably access some form of processing software from a remote location and access your photographs. I don't think you necessarily need to be behind your laptop. So I've just noticed there's some people drawing on the screen. If I could just request that you don't do any annotating. I'm just going to quickly remove those. I see those red lines. Clear all drawings. Okay. Yeah. So if you can just try avoid the annotate button on the Zoom system. All right. So getting back to the presentation. Yeah. So and then when you in your processing software, and I'm going to speak fairly generically about processing because all the systems these days have these functions. It's like we spoke about last week with your camera. When you turn that DSLR camera on for the first time and you look at the hundreds of different adjustments that you can make, we try to focus everyone on the 5 or 6 things that are important. And processing software is very much the same. And I find that if we look at just those 6 items, cropping, exposure, your shadows and highlights, saturation, sharpening, and noise reduction, you're pretty much covering the things that you need to know and use when you're processing an image. There are, in Photoshop, for example, which is the most advanced processing software, you can literally spend 30 minutes creating a whole bunch of different layers. And I used Photoshop for a while, and I found it very, very difficult and very time consuming. But some people have got it down to a fine art and they're very happy using it. Lightroom, I can sit down with an image and within sort of 30 seconds or a minute, I can have processed an image the way I wanted to and then save it. So I think that's the advantage of getting familiar with the system. So let's go into the first aspect of processing. This is generally where I start. Let's get the photograph into a format that looks pleasing on the eye. And there's a few very basic cropping rules. And I'm going to make it very clear that cropping is everybody's personal taste. I find I have certain cropping techniques that may not be as easy on the eye as it is to another person. So these are my personal preferences. People must play around with what they want to do. I think there's some general rules. And Mike, I'd love you to jump in if you disagree with me on any of my processing standards that I have and how you would process photographs a little differently. So sure. Let's start with this African skimmer, which was photographed in the Kazinga Channel in Uganda. So obviously when you're in the field, you're just firing off your camera and you're not thinking of composition. We don't have to do that anymore because we get post-processing with digital photography. In the past, when you were out in the field taking slide film, you'd have to really worry about your composition because it was much more difficult to frame the bird in the right way after the fact. So here's this photograph that I've taken. I've done a little bit of post-processing saturation, but we're focusing on cropping at the moment. Cropping is usually the thing I do first. The bird's a little bit right of center. It's in relatively sharp focus. It's got quite a nice background. It's overwatered. It would be nice if the bill was dipped into the water and it was skimming, but I tended to mess up all the photographs when it did do that. So we'll stick with this one. So my first rule of flight photography when I'm cropping is that you must get the bird flying into space. So I've cropped this one on the screen now in a way that I think it makes the bird look like it's going to fly into a wall. It's too close to the right-hand side of the image, and it's not allowing the bird to fly into the space. And in the green tick that I've brought up now, you can see I've given a little bit more space at the bottom of the screen, and I've given it some space on the right-hand side. And to my eye, it looks a little bit more relaxed. It's a more relaxed way of looking at the bird. It doesn't feel like it's cramped. Mike, do you tend to agree on flight shots around this?
Yeah, I think that's very important, Mike. You do need to give them room to move into the picture, but I also like the right wing. The angle sort of goes directly to that top left corner, which is also quite pleasing.
That's a very good point. When I cropped this, I didn't necessarily think about it, but it's a very important point you raised, and I haven't got it in the presentation, so I'm pleased you raised it. Often with a bird's open wings like that, it's very nice to get that symmetry where you have the point of the wing aimed at the corner of the cropped image. I hope everyone can see what we're talking about. So if I look at my mouse, this wing is pointed, and it's nice to crop it that sort of edge of the wing, or the tip of the wing is aimed at the top left corner of the image. It tends to just frame the bird a little bit better, and maybe the bill should be a little bit the same, but I think I would have probably cropped it too tight on the right-hand side if I tried to achieve the same with the bill. All right, this is probably slightly, what we've tried to do this evening, and maybe this was we had a lot of requests after last week's webinar where we didn't do this. We've included the camera settings of all the photographs that we've taken. There's some that I don't have, so apologies for that. But this just gives all the guys out there ideas of what settings we had, and this goes back to last week. So this is ISO 800. It was with the 500. It was very wide aperture at f4, and then it was beautiful light, 1/8000th of a second. So really nice to freeze the bird in the frame. So I'm not going to refer to this with every slide, but just cast your eye over that, and you'll get a good idea of what settings we used when we took these photographs. So here's a shy albatross on a pelagic trip. Light is perfect. And this was the image of the bird as it was photographed. And maybe just a thing to point out here, and Mike and Dave can concur that pelagic trips is one of those few instances where you actually have to dial back your zoom. But this particular image was taken at 263 millimeters, which is almost, the bird was on top of the boat. This is the image as it was taken. It hasn't been cropped at all. And this shy albatross was probably no more than 4 or 5 meters from the boat and taken at 263 mils. So pelagic photography is an absolute pleasure because you get nice and close. So here, I think it's not too difficult to see that I've chopped off the very tip of the wing. And in instances like this, it's sometimes more difficult with a slightly more cramped bird in the frame. But in this instance, it's very obvious that you really don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you get all parts of the bird in the frame and you don't chop off any body parts. All right, and then this is, I think, mostly a personal preference thing. I know many photographers disagree with me on this or have their own way of doing this. And Mike, I'd once again like your view as we go through this one. This is a Cape rock jumper photographed in the Cape Fold Mountains. This is the photograph as taken. So once again, very fortunate to get nice and close to the bird. And this was the same rock jumper that Mike spoke about last week. We just sat and waited for the birds to come to us when it was feeding young. And in itself, this bird is quite nicely framed in the photograph, but I wanted to do a little bit of processing. But what I don't personally like is to overcrop an image. Particularly when you get, you're very tempted when you get amazing feather detail in a bird, in an image. You like to show off the fact that you got all this amazing feather detail. So all these nice feathers on the back of the bird. You want to show off the fact that you got that amazing feather detail. But you can see I've overcropped the tail. The tail almost looks like it's been chopped off. And the bill of the bird is so close to the left-hand margin that it looks like it has no space. So I prefer to crop it slightly wider than this, where you get a sense of space and freedom for the bird as it's moving about, and particularly action shots where the bird is moving and you want it to be moving into space. Mike, I know we've got some friends that like to crop tighter than this. What is your personal preference?
Yeah, I think that this particular picture definitely works well the way you've done it. There's also that rule of thirds that people refer to, and you can see the rocks sort of make the bottom third and the eye of the bird perhaps closer to the top third. And also the bird moved to the right, so the right 2/3. So it's got a third of the photograph to give it some space. So in general, one likes to work with those rules of thirds as well if you can.
Yeah, and I think that that's another point that you raise. I think what you must avoid doing is having the subject directly in the middle of the frame, which is kind of what I've done over here. Here, the bulk of the bird is actually on the right-hand side of the frame and it's moving into the left. And I think that's that concept of thirds that you're talking about. Have more of the bird on one side of the frame rather than the other, rather than directly in the middle. All right, so once again, the same very friendly rock jumper that we had. And here's a good example of where I got a nice crystal clear image and got the bird with a nice bit of, well, an insect in its mouth. And the problem is I kind of didn't envisage this rock that I was trying to photograph through, so it's kind of a little bit blurred at the bottom. So this was a good instance where I had a nice sharp image and I decided let's do a headshot. So here you get the effect of having that nice sharp image and doing something a little different, showing just the head of the bird. And Mike, I'm going to show some photographs that you've taken where you've got headshots. So let's go to this one. Do you want to talk us through this particular image?
So this was in on the west coast, and I was sitting on rocks rather precariously at the time, if I remember correctly, because the tide was coming in and it was pushing the birds closer and closer and closer to me, and they were quite used to me being there after about 2 hours. And this one sat in a rock very close to me, and with a 600mm lens, it was actually a bit too close. So I just tried to get the head sharp, and then
I'll come on to the slide, but maybe can I confirm that this is the photograph as you took it? You haven't cropped it yet.
No, this is the photograph as taken. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean that's the point, is that you've got this amazing clarity and great sharp image, but the way the bird is in the image, it's not ideally what you want to achieve with that photograph. So you've gone and you've cropped it and you've done an amazing headshot where you can see the beautiful features on the head and the bill of the bird.
Yeah, I am quite partial to the portraits, but I think that's just sometimes because I've got the 600mm lens. When the birds do get close, it's nice to do a headshot.
Absolutely. I don't generally with my 100-400 get close enough to do too many headshots. Right, and then just this another example of just giving a bit of space. So this is the image as I would like to crop it. I haven't cropped it any further. You know, the entire bird is not in the frame, but that's okay because you've got a wonderful sort of Cape Fold mountain rock, and it's a Cape rock jumper, so it's a very good way of illustrating the bird in its habitat. And that brings me to habitat shots. I don't think he's watching, but we've got a good photography friend by the name of Richard Flack. He's got an amazing Instagram page. And he's a real specialist when it comes to habitat shots. And his Instagram page has tons of photos where he's just distanced the bird a little bit in the frame just to show the natural habitat in which it occurs. So this is a southern high leota, which is not a bird we see very often. And I was at Kristenbank near Harare, which is probably the best Miamba patch that I know of. And these southern high leotas are very busy little birds, and they're tricky to get good images of. And I photographed this one in this particular tree. And when I zoom in on it, maybe it's not as sharp as I'd like, and maybe it's just a bit bland, and it doesn't give the effect that I want. So it suited me very nicely to just widen it a little bit and show the bird in its natural habitat. You can see it's a southern high leota, and you can see the habitat in which it lives. So that's one example. Yes.
There are a few questions in the chat group which might be worth touching on. somebody mentioned that a lot of the images seem to be at 1/2000th of a second or more when the birds are static, and I think that's probably because a lot of the time you are photographing birds that are flying or on the move, and you don't always get a chance to dial things down when they are stationary. But you want to be ready for the action at all times. So I suspect that's probably why a lot of the shots are shot at high speeds. And then also the question on cropping, whether one uses a set ratio like 16:9 or 5/7. I don't know what you do, but it very much depends on the image for me, although most of the images that I edit, I do try and stick to the 5:7 a lot of the time, because it's difficult later to upload them to websites if they're all different sizes.
Yeah, so I mean, Mike, that's a great question, because I personally have never paid attention to those ratios. I prefer to crop an image the way I think it should be cropped, regardless of where you want to display it. And I think that's one of the problems that I initially had with Instagram, is that initially it was just a square. That's changed, and you can post an image on Instagram which is not square. But when I post photos on my website, I do have a standard sort of length, and then just let the vertical the vertical size just be what it is. I prefer to not look at the ratios, to be honest, if that's my personal preference.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best thing for the image in the end. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that approach either. There are some images that just won't fit into any standard format that you want to do something unusual with as well.
Yeah, and then when we come to the creativity section, there's some excellent examples of that where there's no ways you're going to be cropping it on the standard ratio. So we'll come to those, and I think that'll be a great way to illustrate that. Yeah, and just getting back to your comment on the shutter speed, yeah, I think I would say exactly the same. I tend to shoot most of my photographs with the aperture as wide open as possible. But when I get a subject that's really behaving well and the light is great, and I've got time on my hands to adjust things, I will probably sort of narrow the aperture a little bit, and then the speed will come down. But it's kind of the rule of thumb that try get as fast a speed as you possibly can when you're in the field, because that's your best chance of capturing the image in a sharp way. So Mike, this is a spectacular photograph, because you've got the flowers, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't know what kind of flowers they are. I mean, I'm not going to put you on the spot unless you want to volunteer it. But this is a great bushveld bird, and it shows the bird in its natural habitat, and it just captures the moment when you were there.
Yeah, I like the color in the picture as well.
Yeah, there's a contrast between the colors of the flower and the white and blues and greens of the bird. All right, so this is a half-collared kingfisher on the Eastern Cape coast. Once again, just showing it in its natural habitat, and then also goes to show that you can do a habitat shot, and then you can also, if you get it nice and sharp, you can do a nice close-up crop of it as well. So there's no reason why a photograph can't double as a habitat shot and a nice sort of close-up. And then this is the very well-known slaty egret. I think if anyone in Gauteng is listening, they all probably have been to GNU Valley Farm or Walkhaven Dog Park and photographed this slaty egret. I was lucky enough to see it when I was there in December last year. And I didn't get any great images of it, but I found that just showing it in amongst the grass is a good way to show a reasonably poor image taken of the bird. Do you tend to do that, Mike, when you find that your image is not maybe as sharp as you'd like it to be? You dial back on the cropping just so that it's a nice usable one, and sometimes you're surprised with the result.
Yeah, especially if you are exporting it to smaller sizes for the web. You know, it doesn't have to be as good as for a poster on the wall, for example. I see somebody also asked about whether we take pictures with the tripod versus handheld, and I think we probably do things a little differently there. I mostly shoot from a tripod.
Yeah. I think we did discuss a little bit of that last week, but yes, I think you tend to carry a tripod. When I'm in the field, I'm often carrying a scope as well. So it's tricky carrying a scope on a tripod as well as a camera on a tripod. So I generally just handhold and have the camera slung over my shoulder. All right, so we're going to go back to some images that we showed last week, which was the concept of over and under exposure. So now once I've cropped my photograph, and Mike, I think your process is probably quite the same, so jump in if not.
No,
once I've cropped my image, I say let's look at the exposure and the lighting, because we want the exposure and lighting to be right. There's no point in having a good photograph if you haven't got that right. So, and I will ask for apologies on this image. It's not my best, but it was a good one to show the principle. So here I've taken this photograph at 1/8000th of a second. The camera's compensated for the bright sky behind, and it's gone very quickly, and it hasn't allowed enough light, and I've lost all the detail on the feathers of this honey buzzard in flight. So this is the exposure and shadows and highlights sort of ruler that pops up on your toolbar when you're in Lightroom, and this is when it's all neutral. So this is as the photograph was taken, and that's your starting point. And it's good when you get started with Lightroom to play around with these things. Just move the dial backwards and forwards. You can always go back to where you originally were, and see what images, how images change as you change those rulers. So on this particular one, I've increased the exposure. I've reduced the highlights, and that's really to prevent the sky from being too white, but I haven't really succeeded too well there. And then I've gone +25 on shadows. And what shadows does is the processing tool is looking at the area of the image that is in shadow, which in this instance is the underwing of the bird, and it's throwing more light on that, or it's taking the pixels and it's saying, well, this pixel is pretty dark. Let's increase the light on that particular pixel where the pixel is dark. So this is how you get this effect of lightening the shadows. And as lousy a photograph as this is, I think it does show the difference between that very dark underwing and then something a little bit lighter. And this is often very useful when it comes to identifying raptors in flight. You might just get a record shot, but when you process it, you turn something very dark into something that's lightened quite nicely. And then definitely one of my favorite photographic subjects of all time was the Southern Royal Albatross. I think I showed one last week. Well, in fact, it was the same image. And the point I was making here is that the photograph isn't necessarily ruined because of the blown whites, and we spoke about that at a bit of length last week. Here you've got the contrast between the dark ocean, the dark wing feathers, and the very white mantle, head, and breast of the bird. And you have a tendency to have this very glaring white effect where you lose the feather detail. So I don't know if this is going to work. That was the setting as taken. What I've done is I've zoomed in, and if you look, and I'm hoping there's enough quality coming through on the Zoom, the Zoom and Facebook feeds, but if you look at this section of the bird, there's very little feather detail to be seen there. But when you work on your rulers over here, and you basically reduce the highlights and you reduce the whites, you get that feather detail coming through. So I've just gone down a little bit on the highlights, and I've just gone down a little bit on the whites. And in this headshot, you can see some very nice feather detail coming through over here. You've actually reduced the amount of glare on the bird's bill from the water, and you've brought in a little bit of feather detail here on the neck and the breast. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on the chat room whether that kind of comes through or not, but it's a very effective tool to use when you've got very bright subjects taken and the whites are blown. Mike, do you use whites and highlights a lot when you're photographing, when you're processing?
Yeah, I think it is useful, especially when there is a very bright section of the bird that's on the subject that you don't want overexposed. But I also make an effort to rather have my dark areas too dark than have my light areas too light.
So does that mean you tend to underexpose a few stops when you're in the field?
In a situation like this, I'd rather have I would rather have the lift out the dark areas in processing than have to try and rescue the highlights that have been blown.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's generally what I try and do as well. I tend to underexpose when I'm in the field. And I think we mentioned this last week. You can always recover an underexposed photograph, but it's very hard to recover blown whites when the data is lost in those pixels.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe
Mike,
going
there's a question.
Yes.
There's a question on the chat. What's the difference between highlight shadows and whites blacks? I think that's referring to your settings.
Okay, so what the whites and blacks do, Dave, is that they specifically are making adjustments to the white pixels and the black pixels. So if you've got a really, really dark bird and you've photographed it as a black bird, the way the camera often exposes it is the black will have absolutely no feather detail. So what you would do with that image is that you would actually increase the light on the blacks, and that brings through some of the feather detail in the black. You may actually want to darken the blacks in some instances because it gives you a little bit more contrast and the colors stand out a bit.
Okay.
Much like the whites where it's only looking at the white pixels. When you're dialing to the left on the whites, you're actually reducing the brightness of the white. Whereas if you dial it to the right, you're going to be increasing the whites. And then shadows and highlights are applying that principle to essentially to all the colors in the pixels on the image. So highlights will look at all bright colors. So if you've got a really bright yellow sort of section of bush behind the bird and it's tending to be glaring and taking away the impact of the bird, you can actually dial down the highlights of those yellows and it just dulls a little bit so that the bird looks more and pops out more at you.
Okay, great. There's also a question about bird direction. Graham saying that he was told that if a bird is moving, it should always be facing right. Do you or Michael have a view on that?
I prefer the variation. I know there is the idea that we are sort of trained to look from left to right because that's how we read. But I don't subscribe to that rule all the time. I certainly don't switch my images around. I have birds from both sides, although I understand the reasoning behind it.
Yeah, Dave, I very seldom switch my images around, and certainly when you're in the field, you're not going to be ignoring opportunities of birds flying from right to left. But in a presentation like this, for example, if I wanted to keep the information like I have on the right-hand side and the bird on the left, you tend to want the bird to be facing to the right. But that's really, it's quite subjective when it comes to how you present your images. But I don't necessarily think it's a problem to have a bird flying from right to left or facing from right to left.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so this is just a very classic example. I was in Peru last year, and this was a bird I'd wanted to see my whole life. It's a sword-billed hummingbird, and it's the only bird on the planet that's bill is longer than its body. It's one of the world's most iconic birds. And we went to a small farmyard, and there was a feeder, and this male sword-billed hummingbird was coming to the feeder in this very difficult dappled light. And I think I took one photograph of the bird as it briefly perched on this branch. And when I got back to the hotel that evening, or the lodge we were staying at, I looked at the image and I thought, well, that's a throwaway. But the amazing thing about Lightroom is that you can come back into the lab and you can actually fix things. So here's all the settings as they were taken. And then with a bit of work, by increasing the exposure a little bit, decreasing the highlights. And Dave, this was a point I was trying to make. As you brighten the exposure, you brighten the background as well. I wanted to dull that down so that the highlights are dulled down. And I've lifted all the dark shadows and bringing through that sort of green and coppery sheen on the actual image of the bird. So this is a classic example of how digital photography has transformed our ability to recover great images that we've taken in the field that are nice and sharp, but the lighting and the exposure was just not quite right. So this was without a flash and able to resurrect a photograph of a bird that I thought I'd have to throw away. All right, so
there's a comment from Nigel Cornfield is saying that the normal photo manager is exposed to the right, i.e. overexposed. because when you process it, when you process to bring up shadows, you increase the noise while bringing down the whites. There's no increase in noise. That's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's probably fine if it's a white wedding dress, but in terms of feather detail on the birds, I don't feel the same way. And yes, if you do, if you do lift out the dark areas, you do increase noise. So ideally, you want to get the exposure perfect for both. But unfortunately, lighting conditions aren't always easily manipulated in the field. And I definitely feel that it's easier to lift out the darker areas if you got it slightly wrong than it is to try and resurrect feather detail in the overexposed highlights. Sometimes it doesn't really matter if it's not really the subject in your photograph. So if you're shooting a person in a white wedding dress, the bit you're wanting to focus on is not necessarily the dress, is not necessarily where your focus point is. And then the detail there is perhaps not as important.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think the example you're using is that when you're photographing someone in a wedding dress, you want the facial features to be what are prominent. Whereas with a bird with white feathers, you actually want that feather detail. You want to be able to see the feather detail in the whites. But thanks, a very good question. And I think the point I made a few minutes ago was that a lot of these things are personal preferences. So these are just the things that we feel we like to achieve, but it definitely doesn't mean it's right. All right, saturation, and this is another personal preference thing. I have a very strong belief that many photographers oversaturate when they're processing. So essentially, the process of saturation in processing is to enhance the brightness of the colors of the image you've taken. So if you've got a beautiful, gorgeous bushwhack that you've photographed and it's in fairly dull light, it's really nice to be able to enhance that by using the saturation tool. So here's a sentinel rock thrush, and it's one of our stunning endemics. It's got a beautiful gray head and mantle and back, and then it's got this wonderful orange belly. And this is the image as it was photographed. It has been cropped. I did crop it, but this is the lighting. This is the exposure as it was taken. So what I've done now is I've gone into saturation, and I've on purpose gone a bit berserk on the saturation. So if I look at this, if I saw this bird in the field, I wouldn't think it was a sentinel rock thrush. I'd probably think it was a new species to science, because the orange on the belly is definitely not that pronounced. So not only have I pronounced the orange there, but I've also pronounced the orange on the rocks. And it does create something that doesn't look like what you'd see in the field. So I think this is just a cautionary thing, is just be careful with your saturation. So here I've only gone a tiny bit up on saturation, and I've gone +3 on saturation here. And that orange is bright enough for me. And I think it's it also depends on your exposure. This was taken in beautiful morning light. So very often when photographs are well exposed in perfect morning light, at that sort of 7 o'clock time in the morning, 1 hour after sunrise, you very seldom have to spend too much time on saturation. When you're taking photographs of birds at midday, when the sun is directly overhead and things are very sort of hazy and monochrome, that's probably the opportunity for you to use your saturation. Mike, do you agree? Do you see a lot of photographs that are oversaturated?
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. I also, just as an interesting side, a lot of the time eye conditions also affect how people see images. So cataracts can often make images look washed out, and people compensate a little bit with overexposing so that it looks right to them.
Yeah, and I guess the quality of your computer screen, and that's something that we haven't raised at all. But when you're processing photos, make sure that your camera, your computer is fully charged, because when computers go into sleep mode, what tends to happen is the screen dulls. I don't know if anyone's experienced that. Have you experienced that, Mark, where you've processed a whole lot of photos without realizing it's in battery saving mode, and you go and oversaturate all of them?
Yeah, absolutely. The screen makes a big difference. And also getting your, if you are printing images, making sure that what you're seeing on your screen matches what you're seeing when you're printing the images. But that's a whole new level of obsessive.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever gone down that road of printing too many images. All right, and then just another example of saturation, and I was trying to show this forest canary was photographed in relatively sort of dullish light. It's nicely, it's a nice light angle, but the colors seem to be lost. And then my intention was to process it from a saturation point of view correctly, but I obviously had my screen dull, and I've gone over the top here. So that's not how most forest canaries look. So you can see plus 26 was probably just too much. But it's a good illustration of how easy it is to get carried away when you're trying to bring out those beautiful bright colors. All right, and then black and white. Yeah, Mike, I've got one of your images in this set here, but I don't do a lot of conversion to black and white. I think in the old days you used to have to use black and white film. Now we've got a very easy toggle on our tool palette where we can convert any image we want to black and white. And it's sometimes difficult to know which image would suit black and white and which one doesn't. So it's so easy to just play with it. This was a white-headed petrel that we saw on Flock about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's an image that I absolutely love, and even processed with color. This is the color version. I enjoy it like this, but I then decided to just test the black and white. And it just gives it a completely different feel. And I quite enjoy the way the black and white has changed the nature of the image. It's almost a bit more of a mood. And the same goes for this southern fulmar, where it's on the ocean and it looks a bit grey and it brings in a bit of mood. So I think black and white is once again something easy to play with, and it's a personal preference. And then Mike, this is your great zebra shot. Is this a bird?
I don't ignore the mammals if they're around.
Yeah, I'm gonna give everyone a mammal warning, because we've got some shots coming up that are well worth sharing, even though they're not birds. So this is just to ease them into it. But yeah, I love this shot. And I think in black and white it just works so well, even though it is a black and white animal, bizarrely.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm not going to spend too long on sharpening. Sharpening was something I used a lot in the past. I think it's something that you'd only want to use if your images are taken in RAW, because as we mentioned last week, if you take a photograph in JPEG, the actual conversion to JPEG when you take the photograph is already doing a degree of sharpening, and sharpening once again, like saturation. The thing you've got to avoid doing is to over sharpen, because it makes things look very very unnatural. And the very important point is this one in the middle here. Sharpening isn't a magic trick. You can't take an image that you've taken that's out of focus and expect that the sharpening tool is going to convert it to an image that is in focus. So Mike, do you use sharpening a lot, or do you find that it's more than the noise reduction that you focus on?
Yeah, I would say, it depends on what you're photographing, and you can set your camera even in the different settings. You can set it to sharpen. If you're shooting JPEGs, you can set how sharp it makes the pictures or how soft it makes the pictures, and that's why they've got those different settings available. But I find that I do sharpen most images, but I don't sharpen them a lot. I sharpen them a little. You want to get them sharp the first time when you take the picture, but I do sharpen most images, especially if I'm shrinking them, if I'm making them smaller or exporting them to a smaller JPEG size. They all get sharpened a little, but you don't want to overdo it.
Yeah, just to get rid of a bit of the softness when your resolution is a bit lower.
Yeah, if you're shooting pictures of people, you don't necessarily want your pictures to be super, super, super sharp. You want a little bit of a softer look sometimes there. But for feathers and for birds, I do quite enjoy having them sharp.
Mike, you're kind of giving things away here. You've mentioned wedding dresses and taking photographs of people. Is there something you want to tell us, maybe?
No.
Okay, you've got a hobby within a hobby. All right, so noise reduction is what I think has become very popular, particularly with the ability to shoot at very high ISO to get that image sharp. We spoke about it last week. When you take very high ISO images, you're going to get a lot of grain, but at least you're getting the image sharp because you've increased your shutter speed. So noise reduction is something that I've used a lot more over the last few years. Once again, there's a caution, and I'm hoping my illustration comes through on the quality of the Zoom and Facebook feeds. Over sharpening, over reducing the noise tends to make the images look a bit cartoon-like. So here's the Cape Rock thrush. I've cropped it quite tightly just for illustration purposes. It's taken at ISO 500, so it's not particularly high, but I just wanted to illustrate the principle. Here, my noise reduction's at a level of 18, which is kind of more or less where I generally end with reasonable ISO photographs. And then I've gone and I've just bumped it up to 91 just for illustrative purposes. And I hope that it comes through. What you've got here is, let me just go back to that. You might not be able to see the grain that well, but there's grain in the background here. And there's obviously grain a little bit in the actual bird subject. Here, the grain in the background is completely disappeared. It's like a very, very sort of monotone canvas. But the problem you have is the actual bird has gone a little bit cartoon-like. A lot of the feathers over here are very cartoony, and particularly around the eye, it almost looks like it's been painted rather than photographed. Mike, do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I agree. It smooths it out too much, so you lose some detail.
And can you see, you're obviously watching on the Zoom feed, whereas I'm looking at the presentation in its original format. Can you see that effect of the paintbrush there? Okay, good. All right, and here's an illustration of where noise reduction really works well. Here's a photograph taken in the rainforest in Peru. It's an ornate flycatcher. And it was photographed at 2,500 ISO, which in the modern day terms is actually not that high. But for my Canon 7D Mark II, it is quite a high ISO number. There's quite a lot of grain, and I'm showing it here in this particular snip. You can see a huge amount of grain in the background, and actually a lot of grain in the actual subject. There's quite a nice lot of feather detail, and I've achieved the objective of getting a sharp image, but there's just so much grain that it detracts from the image. So I've gone and I've reduced it by 25 points here, and you can see the grain is significantly reduced. I hope you can all see that. The grain here is substantially less, and it's turned a photograph that was very grainy into something that's actually a lot softer and more pleasing on the eye. Here's the original, and here's the noise reduced version on the right hand side.
Mike, do you have the ability to reduce noise in particular areas of the photo, or do you have to do it to the entire photo?
Dave, the setting that I use, it's for the entire photo. Mike, do you know if there's a setting where you can reduce noise just on the background or on parts of the bird?
Depends on which program you're using, Mike. I think in Lightroom that would be very difficult. I think if you're using Photoshop, you can start using layers and cutting areas and reducing noise in specific areas.
Yeah, I think that's the point with Photoshop. You can use those layers, and I think you can focus on certain areas of the image with each layer.
Cool, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dave. All right, this is where I tend to not have much to add. I'm an accountant by profession, and I have a very low level of creativity with my photographs. I'm generally trying to get a nice sharp image that is nice, crisp and clear and is in a nice habitat. So when I'm out in the field, I don't see the opportunity. So Mike, I'm going to go through 3 or 4 of your images here. Maybe you just talk to us about what you were thinking when you took these images and what your settings were. Unfortunately, I don't have the settings on these, but just talk us through these. This is a really creative image of a pintailed wider.
Yeah, those are quite tough when the bird is flying towards you. But, you know, looking at backgrounds, you typically don't really want a very white background, but in this particular image it works, and the bird is sort of the darker feathers, the darker tail feathers and the darker feathers in the wings stand out with the image there. What I did there was I blew out the highlights behind the bird, which was already a fairly light vibrocrete wall, I think it was, and basically tried to make the background, which wasn't very pleasing, disappear.
Yeah, that's it's hard to believe there was a vibrocrete wall behind that, because it just looks like it's sky. But that just goes to show what highlights can actually do. And then I love this shot. It's a real portrait or headshot, but it's very creative.
Yeah, I think it's just getting different perspectives on birds. Sometimes just adds a new dimension. You don't always get the view that that the heron has, and how it looks down, those two eyes just looking down the bill and able to focus on what it's spearing. But yeah, getting a different angle, different perspective sometimes adds something interesting to the photograph.
And it also gives you more to do in the field. So if it's a slow day and your subjects are relatively commonplace birds, you know you've got a great shot of a black-headed heron already. Let's take something a little different that'll be more creative. I guess that's why you do this.
Yeah.
And then your African spoonbill, and this is a good illustration of those white feathers where there's actually a lot of detail in them.
Yeah, so sometimes, you know, I often find myself in the position of being too close, and you know, all you can do then is look at interesting ways of cropping the bird to still show something interesting about the bird. So this is a spoonbill, and you can't really see the spoony bit at the end of the bill, but it still makes for a very interesting photograph, particularly with the early morning light that was making the water behind it look yellow.
Yeah, and I think the way you've cropped it, the bill is going into that corner of the bottom left of the image, and even though it's an African spoonbill, and you'd expect that any photo of a spoonbill should show you the spoon of the bill, it just shows that you can see something different in an image like this that's a little bit more creative.
It's also interesting if you do the rule of thirds. If you divide that picture into thirds, both in the vertical and in the horizontal, it's often nice to put your eye where two of those lines cross.
Yes, yes. Great. Very, very nice. Okay, so this is not the creative one. That's my photograph. That's why it's not creative at all. And then we're not going to let Mike talk about this amazing king penguin that some of us had the fortune to see in October, November last year. But I wanted to show you when you're a non-creative person like me, you take a headshot of a king penguin. But then if you're Mike Mason, you take a photograph like this, or you crop it like this. And I think it's a wonderful illustration of the feathers of a king penguin. And then some more mammals, Mike.
Yeah, no, sometimes, again, you know, if you're shooting birds, most of the time the mammals tend to be too close. So it's nice to pick up the patterns and yeah, do something a little bit different. So I enjoy actually taking sort of a part of the animal, and it does give a different perspective often, which I enjoy.
Great photos. I love these zebra pics. And who knew that a zebra tail had the alternating black and white like a chessboard? One wonders how that ever happened. All right, so file naming, we're going to go through this quite quickly because this really is very much a personal preference thing. The key for when you're naming your files after you've processed it. So the last step in processing an image is when you export it to a file that you'll save on your computer or on a hard drive or in the cloud. Find a consistent way of naming things so that when you're looking for them and when you're searching, you know how to search because you've named it in a consistent manner. So my particular preferred methodology is to go family name, comma, space, species name, space, dash, space, and then the date in which the photograph was taken. And it is that specific because I know that when I'm looking for this red-winged warbler photograph that I took, I can just go warbler, comma, space R, and it starts putting up all the red-winged warbler photographs that I've taken, or it might have a rufous-eared warbler, but I start narrowing it down. So that's my methodology. Before we talk about your naming convention, Mike, this is definitely one of my favorite photographs of yours. This is an absolutely spectacular shot of this oxpecker.
Thanks, Mike. Somebody also asked, why don't we use the keywords in Lightroom? And I think that is a good point. You can definitely add keywords to photographs in Lightroom so that if you just search for that keyword, all those photographs pop up. It's what I did the other day as well. The metadata is all there. When you ask me, do I have any photographs of shot at f8? I can literally search for photographs shot at f8. or if you're looking for a specific birds, if you put in the keyword and you say oxpeckers, it will pull up all the images that were labeled oxpecker. So it is a useful way, but I think if you're not using Lightroom in the future, or you still want to be able to find that file somewhere, even if you're not using the Lightroom platform.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I did think about tagging of images in Lightroom. So what that references to is every time you have an image downloaded on your computer and you're working on it in Lightroom, you just add a tag and you can name it with the tag of the bird's name, family name, the date you took it, or the place you took it, and then it makes it easy to search in Lightroom. But the minute you start looking for it as a processed image in your Explorer or on Dropbox, those tags don't necessarily help you in searching for those images. And I found it quite time consuming to tag my images, because if you've taken photographs of 20 different species in the morning, you're going to have to tag 20 different species over, say, 500 images. It can be, for me, it's a little bit cumbersome. So Mike, you rename your originals, which is original CR2 or RAW image, as well as name your finally exported images. Is that right?
I've set it on the camera and on the computer that when I export it, it actually exports it into those folders. So it will import it into those folders. It will import it into a folder called 2020, and then in that folder there'll be a folder called 01 or 02 for January or February, and then in there there'll be the day it was taken, etc.
That's actually very useful. I personally haven't done that, but it's probably because I'm a bit disorganized. But that's a very useful feature. So you're actually setting on your camera settings, you're creating
it's done automatically. It's not something I do. It's something that's done just in the importing process.
Fantastic. So that's how it's named your particular file, the date and then the original file name. And then when you export it, you have a slightly different way of naming your images. You go a species name, the scientific name, and then a descriptor. If it's a bird in flight or a portrait or a feeding or whatever nest, you might do something like that.
Yeah, it might not always have a description, but if it is something interesting that I want to describe, I sometimes add that in as well.
Okay, great. And then I think naming images and saving them on an external hard drive or in Dropbox, that brings us on to storage. And there are 3 things guaranteed in life. Everybody thought there were only 2 things that were guaranteed in life, with death and taxes. But there's a third one, and that is if you don't find an effective way to back up your photos, you will lose them at some stage. And that's very true. I know I've been very fortunate and I haven't lost anything significant. Have you lost pics, Mike?
Oh yeah, no, for sure.
And Dave, have you had a massive data crash where you've lost images?
I lost a hard drive. I plugged my laptop power cable into my external hard drive in error and fried it.
Oh dear.
But I was luckily able to retrieve those photos. Cost me quite a lot of money, but yeah, so I managed to pull the one back. So I paid some school fees there.
No, definitely. And I think storage is vital. And I think what we're going to just talk about is some of the different needs and requirements. So there's 2 different types of backups. There's obviously your original files, which is your original CR2 and RAW files, which are obviously very big, and you might have many of the same species taken in the field that you don't want to throw away because you might come back to them. And then there's your processed and saved final images. So with original files, I personally think that we are going to take too many terabytes of photographs in our lifetime to use the cloud as an option. It will just be your cloud storage costs are going to be exorbitant, the way they're priced at the moment, and it also chews up data as you're uploading and downloading from the cloud. So I think original files, Mike, you would suggest using a backup system, and what we'll come to is Mike's backup system. But before we do, just to talk about processed and saved images, and this is where I've focused a lot of my energy is I use cloud storage, and we'll come to each specific. So just looking at Mike's system. Mike, do you want to talk us through that box?
Yeah, so that's a network attached storage. Essentially, it's just a 5 bays of 6 terabyte hard drives that are in there. And you can set them up in different ways so that even if 2 of them fail at the same time, you just pop 2 new drives in there and the data is refilled so that you don't lose anything.
And Mike, do you, does this solve any problems when it comes to offsite storage? So in the unfortunate event that someone broke into your house and picked up this box knowing that it was worth some money to sell, and then you lose all the images, is there a way that you can manage that particular loss as well?
So what I do is everything gets automatically backed up from the hard drives on my computer to the network attached storage there. And then the specific years, I'll have those 4 terabyte or hard drives that will have 1 or 2 years. Yeah, so they will have 1 or 2 years worth of photographs on them. So that gets stored at work. So you have something at home and something at work.
Yeah, and I think that's key, is just to have a separation between your working folders and where you want to have your storage. Because if someone does break into your house or the house burns down, that's where you're at mercy of losing everything. So a pointer out there for those of you that don't do that, even if it means buying a 4 terabyte drive and backing your photos up and dropping it off at a friend's house or your mother or your daughter or your son's house, just to make sure that you've got something in case you lose your primary storage.
Mike,
right. Yes.
Do you keep all your shots, or do you only keep your good ones and throw everything else away?
Dave, what I generally do, I have a 2-step process. One is at the end of the day, when I've been in the field, I actually spin through my photographs on the LED screen at the back of the camera, and I do a cleanup on the camera. Because you can't see the detail, sometimes you just keep a lot of images because you're not sure until you see it on a screen. And it also allows you to have card space, and you don't come back with 10, 32 gig cards full of data that's going to take you forever to go through. So when I come home, I then upload it into Lightroom, and then I generally will go through the Lightroom dump and then delete photos that I don't necessarily want. But because data storage is relatively cheap, I tend to be a bit of a hoarder. So I do keep a lot of the original files that I take once I've uploaded them.
Cool, thanks.
All right, so I have backups of my original files, but my energy is spent on the processed stuff. I save 2 versions of the processed stuff. I save one version which is the maximum size. So you've got a setting when you're exporting that you want to save it as a JPEG with maximum output size. And then I save one version purely for uploading to my website. So that's got a standard size, and generally it's about 300 kilobytes. So very, very small storage space. The original files all depends on how you've cropped the image and how much processing it has taken. But you'll find that a 25 meg photo will probably be cropped down to something like a 2 or 3 meg photo if it's quite good quality. So I save all my stuff on Dropbox. You've got the various packages there. I upload it to a folder which I very originally called All Photos. So that's kind of a list of all my albatross pics. And the great thing is there's a Dropbox app on that you can upload on your phone that is obviously comes with the Dropbox application on my computer. So if I'm searching if I'm sitting at my desk and there's a discussion on a birding WhatsApp group about a cinnamon woodpecker and I want to show off my photograph, I just open the app on my phone. I search woodpecker, CIN, because that's how I know I've named my file. And then it pops up the options, and then I click on that particular option. There's my cinnamon woodpecker photo, and these little 3 dots here in Dropbox, if you click on those, it allows you to export the image either to a photo on your phone, or you can then share it either on WhatsApp or on email or on a variety of platforms. So that's my particular methodology, and once again, it's a personal preference, but that's kind of how organize things. So just very quickly, if your photographs are good enough, people may ask you for them, particularly if you display them on Instagram and on a website, or you share them on Facebook. You might get calls to share your photographs for publication. So Mike, I'm just going to spin through some of your published images. A lot of them are rarity photographs because Mike's one of our top twitchers out there. So Elegant Tern at Strandfontein, the Ross's Chiraco in Namibia, the Little Ring Plover in Onrus. We spoke about Mike's snake and swallow story, and then his wonderful photos of the Cape Rock Jumper. We saw that image last week. And then a wonderful story about the Upchur's Warbler at Tankatara. So the big debate around published photographs is you'll never get a publisher who'll contact you and say, we'd love to pay you 500 Rand an image. We'll put the money in your bank account, and then can you send us the high resolution files? What normally happens is they ask you if you've got an image of a certain bird, and you say, yes, I do, and you send them a little 200 kilobyte version, and they say, that's awesome, we'd love to have one of those. And then they say, but unfortunately, we don't have the budget to be able to pay you for your image. I think BirdLife, African BirdLife is extremely good. They do pay for images, but they love it if you donate to BirdLife. And I'm always very happy donating my images to BirdLife magazine. And those contributions go to the organization. But commercial ventures, it's a bit more tricky because very seldom do publishers have the money for sort of third-party photographers. So you've got to kind of make a rule in your head as to how valuable your photographs are to you. For me, I often will ask the publishers if it's possible in exchange for the image that they can send me a copy of the book that they are publishing. And so a lot of the books on my shelf, I've ended up not paying anything for them because I've exchanged them for photographs that ended up in there. And it's a hell of a kick to receive a book in the post sent by someone from overseas because they published an image of yours in their book. So there was this Ultimate Companion, which is an outstanding book, which has got so many amazing images. Over the years, some of my photographs that I've taken were required for that. This is a Cape Rock Jumper photograph I took many years ago in Royals, and it kind of captures a rock jumper quite well. And then probably my most prized image is this Mauritius olive white-eye, which is one of the world's rarest birds. And I stand under correction, but it may be the only image of a Mauritius olive white-eye where the bird doesn't actually have a ring on either of its legs. Because they are so rare, just about every single individual bird that is in existence has a ring on its leg. And when I was in Mauritius on holiday with the family, I went birding and was lucky enough that this one popped up onto a branch and posed. And when I processed the image, I noticed it was so-and-so ring. So, and we spoke about the green-breasted pitter. So then, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. There's a quick question just about like, how do you get your photos off your camera onto your laptop or whatever you're going to put them on? Do you just take it off the card, or you plug it directly into the camera? How do you do that? And then also, how do you keep your batteries charged on a trip?
Okay, so to answer the first question, you can either, there's a connection that goes from when you get your digital camera, there'll be a cable that allows you to plug the camera into your laptop or your desktop. And generally, whatever software you're using, when you plug that camera into your computer, it'll actually launch the program and say, I see you've got photographs, would you like to download them on Lightroom? And then you simply download them. I've tended to find that, particularly with my Canon 7D Mark II, that the speed of download is pretty slow when it comes to downloading directly off the camera. So I've just bought a relatively cheap card reader where you get a whole lot of different cards that it can read, an SD card and a compact flash card, and you plug that into your computer, and the same thing happens. It launches Lightroom. Lightroom says, I see you've got photographs on that storage device. Would you like to upload them? And then it brings the photographs up, and then you basically upload them into a named folder. And then your next question, Dave, I've forgotten.
Batteries, how do you keep them charged on a long trip? So when you went to Mozambique, did you have a, were you able to recharge, or did you take disposables? How did you manage that?
Yeah, I don't. So all these camera batteries are rechargeable. And so I generally take 3 batteries with me. And you must test them before you go, because these batteries do suddenly die. And then you take a battery charger. So in a 2-week trip, 2-week birding trip where you're spending hours in the field, 3 batteries is going to last you probably 3 days, if that. So if you're going somewhere where you're not going to be able to charge, then you need to make a different plan. But generally, the places you go will have power. And then I think you can get car adjustments as well. I think you can probably get a car charger, and then you can plug that in and charge your battery using the cigarette plug.
Yeah, I think
Cool,
spare cards and spare batteries are very, very important. I also even have 2 chargers that I take with me when I go on a trip. My one charger broke on a trip to Kruger, and if you ever want to see a grown man beg, I went from hut to hut trying to find somebody who had a charger who would charge my batteries.
Yeah, I think we haven't really highlighted that much, but yeah, I agree with you 100%. You do not want to run out of card space in the field or actually on a trip, and you definitely don't want to run out of battery.
And card readers are definitely the way to go, Mike. I never plug my camera into a laptop. I always use card readers.
Okay, yeah, I think it's much faster and probably a little bit safer as well. All right, so sharing of photographs, beyond publishing them in coffee table books and field guides and magazines, Instagram has become the platform that I really enjoy. And Mike, you're also on Instagram. So, I mean, Instagram is I think it's much nicer than Facebook because it's less opinionated. So if you want to post a photo and not have half the world tell you that you're not a nice person because of something that you did that you didn't know you were doing, Instagram is a much better place than Facebook, in my opinion. So I have an Instagram page, which is Buck and Birding. So if anyone wants to follow me, that's my handle. And Mike, you've also got an Instagram page, which is Michael is Birding. And Instagram is great. I follow a lot of bird photographers, and I've learned an enormous amount about the world of birds. I follow an amazing photographer who's an Australian guy. I follow a Turkish guy, a couple of Americans, lots of Europeans, and some of the images that you see on Instagram are just absolutely phenomenal. So if you're not on Instagram and you're interested in bird photography or birds on their own, I would recommend it. And then Facebook, we all know Facebook. It's a great platform to elicit a bit of discussion. And then I love sharing my photographs in these types of platforms. Okay, to finish off with, just a little bit on the ethical side of birding, and I think it would be wrong for us to have these series of webinars and talk about photography unless we worry about the actual subjects that we're photographing. So the first rule is, and going back to that photograph, that was obviously at Twitch in the UK, so it's not specifically photographic related, but you can imagine that the person on the other side of that wall wasn't too pleased. So don't trespass, don't climb fences, don't go into people's property unless you have permission, because it's a quick way to make birders and photographers very unpopular. And then, this is not necessarily relevant, but when you're in the field, just respect your fellow birders and fellow photographers. So there's often conflict between photographers and birders in touring groups, and I spoke about that last week. But if you're trying to photograph, this was a harpy eagle we photographed in Panama. If there's a good spot to take the image and the bird is being obliging, don't hog that spot because there are other people who would like to take the same image. So just remember to respect your birders. And then, Mike, these are both your photographs, and I use them because they refer to nests, but maybe you just want to talk about these pics. That Cape Longclaw on the right is absolutely spectacular, and it should have fallen under the creativity section.
Yeah, I was very disappointed to have a single blade of grass in the foreground there, but other than that, the lighting was beautiful, and I enjoyed the patterns in the dragonfly's wings and the spider web behind the bird as well. But it was quite a spectacular morning. And the other ones I think are Mozambique, a trip to see the Saunders tern.
Yeah, and I think these olive bee eaters were obviously not too concerned about you being close to the nest, but there are instances where nests are extremely sensitive.
Yes, no, for sure.
I mean, I went to a talk many, many years ago, and we're talking probably 15 to 20 years ago, where there was someone presented a talk on photographing Knysna warblers in the green belts in Cape Town. And I was appalled that he made reference to finding a nest. I won't name the photographer. I can't actually remember his name, but he found a Knysna warbler nest, which are obviously extremely well concealed. They're one of the most secretive birds that we have. And he clipped away vegetation in order to get better photographs of the adults coming to feed the chicks. There were still eggs on the nest, and the next morning he came to take his photographs, and he was shocked and amazed that the eggs had been taken by a predator out of the nest. So that's like an absolutely extreme example. A lot of the examples are a lot more subtle, but that's an absolute no-no. And then obviously you may have views on playback. Some people use playback quite a bit, and I think if you go on an international bird tour, you'll see playback used quite regularly. I think the rule around playback is don't overuse, and don't use playback when birds are breeding, because it creates some distress. And then bird habitat. I snipped this off the web. This is Warwick Tarboton's photograph of a highly endangered white-winged flufftail. The habitat in which these birds live is extremely sensitive. And so when you're trying to photograph a white-winged flufftail, don't do it on your own. Do it with one of the organized flushes, and contribute to bird life in conserving these types of birds. And then don't try and change the behavior. And the reason I took this photograph as an example, this is a much better image of this rock jumper carrying food. But Mike told the story well last week where, let the birds come to you and do their thing that they do and go about their daily activities without you encroaching too closely. And then lastly, don't overuse flashes or spotlights. This particular image was taken in Peru and was actually taken without a flash. It was taken using the light from a torch flashlight. And we would keep the torch off the bird, and then I'd say, okay, I'm ready to take a photo, and it was like 2 or 3 seconds of flashlight or torchlight on the bird, and then it was a quick pick. So just be very careful when it comes to that. All right, and we're going to lead into the last section, which I'm going to leave totally up to you, Mike. I've selected my favorite set of images that Mike has taken, and it's a bit of a story, and it's a great way to finish, especially since they're photographs of something that's not a bird. So you ready, Mike? Oh, last photo. That was a big lead up to nothing. When you're taking photographs of captive birds, make sure you disclose that when you publish or present it. This particular bird wasn't captive. It's a Mauritius kestrel, but it was a bird that they fed, given the conservation status of it. And I'm proud to call it a bird in the wild, because it is a wild bird, but it's worth disclosing how you got the image. And if it's a captive bird, then say so in the caption. All right, Mike, over to you. Let's hear your leopard image story, and we can finish off with that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, this was in Kruger. It was a very special moment. The day before, I found the cubs rolling around, but the light was harsh, and they were far away, and they were rolling around, playing with the dung balls and things there. So I went back again the next morning, maybe just to say that you need to be a birder if you want to find the leopards, because you hear the alarm calls from birds and things, and you pick up a lot more in the bush. But yeah, we went back the next morning, and the light was a lot better. I didn't notice at first. I was watching, she had 3 cubs. I was watching 2 that were a little further away, and then suddenly saw that in the tree right next to me, there was a cub lying on the branch. And then the mom arrived as well, and stood in the V of the tree there, took a glance up to the kill that she'd hung in the tree the day before, and then jumped up to go and fetch it for them. Picked the male impala up like it weighed just about nothing. It was so amazing to watch, and took it down for breakfast basically. And then I watched all the kids, all the cubs, basically coming to eat. They were watching the mom fetch. On the right, you can see the one little cub was watching mom fetch dinner up there. This image on the left is one of my favorites. quite a menacing look and how low she is up there. And the cub on the right was at the bottom looking up to mom, and then the cub in the tree next to me in the next picture was slowly starting to come down for breakfast, and resulted in some of my favorite pictures of leopards that I've taken. This is where he started down, and as he went, I was a bit annoyed because it was climbing down the other side of the tree, but as it was going down the tree, it stopped and looked around the corner to see if I was still there. And it was a very special moment with some nice light behind it as well. So yeah, definitely one of my favorite moments in the bush. I'd photographed cubs before, but this was certainly something very, very special.
Yeah, Mike, I think these are mammal photographs, but so many of the principles we've spoken about around bird photography apply here. And there's nothing more incredible than capturing these totally natural moments, almost as if you weren't there, and seeing animals behave in a way that's totally natural. These last two cub images are just the most phenomenal photos, and I think very lucky to have experienced it, but I'm pleased you had image stabilizer, because I would have been shaking too much to take images like this.
These are the moments you live for, Mike, is when you're there and you're in the moment and they're just behaving like they would usually behave, spending quite a bit of time with them, going about their business. And the same for birds. Too often we drive up to the bird and all you get is a tail shot of the bird leaving. But letting them become accustomed to you and letting them do their thing around you, it's the behavior that's interesting, and that's also when you get the nicest photographs.
Yeah, fantastic, Mike. And I think it's an extremely good way to finish our two talks on bird photography. I think what remains is for me to thank you very much for giving of your time and a lot of your very prized images, and for sharing them with us. And your knowledge and experience. I think it's been extremely valuable. I hope people have learned a lot. And yeah, just a big thank you to all our listeners. We've had such great feedback from these webinars. I know they are quite long, and I appreciate everyone hanging in there. And we've had great fun during lockdown preparing them. We have an idea about next week. We can't quite decide whether we've got enough energy to do a fourth one in the space of 4 weeks. But Dave, maybe hand over to you. Maybe you can just finish off and say goodbye to everybody, and we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I just want to echo what you said, Mike, about thanking Michael. It's really been fantastic having you, and your images are amazing, and I've learned heaps. So yeah, thanks so much, and yeah, thank you, Mike. This has been a brilliant presentation. Great breaking it up into 2 parts, and yeah, I look forward to seeing everyone in the next one.
Great, thanks everybody. We'll be communicating with you. Dave sorted out our tech a little bit there, so we'll communicate via the web, the email addresses you've given us, and we'll let you know if we're going to be doing something next week. But stay safe, keep well, and hopefully see you guys out in the field with your cameras, and we can compare some images. And if you would like to share some images with us, you're very welcome to do so, and we'd love to look at them and maybe comment on them and see what you guys have been up to as well. So sleep well, and we'll see you next week, hopefully.
Thanks, guys. Be safe.